Welcome to Reddit Family Drama Time. Stay tuned for the video breakdown at the end.
Thanks, Mum. Now I have a police record. Posted to r/am I the asshole. My mum told the police I threatened her with a weapon. Now I have a violence order, a court date, and a charge of threatening behavior on record, all from a single afternoon in a garden where I was picking basil. I've been sitting on this for a while because every time I try to write it out, I feel like I sound unhinged, which is, I suppose, exactly what she would want you to think. So let me start from the beginning, not the garden, the real beginning, because nothing about that afternoon makes any sense unless you understand the 20-something years that led up to it. My name is Alice. I'm in my early 20s. I grew up in a small coastal town, the kind of place that looks idyllic if you're passing through, and is a lot more complicated if you're living inside it. My mum was a school librarian, my dad was a graphic designer who worked from home. And from the very beginning, the architecture of our family was pretty simple. Dad was warm, present, flexible. Mum was there, she was always there, but her attention moved toward her own interests first and filtered down from there. That's not a condemnation, that's just an honest description of how it was. I was a sporty kid, that's the most important thing to understand about me, and I didn't fully understand why it was important until much later. Sport gave me everything I needed in one place: rules, structure, a clear set of expectations about how to behave and what success looked like, a physical outlet that kept my nervous system regulated in a way nothing else quite managed, and a social environment where I knew my role, where the rules of engagement were explicit and consistent, unlike the rules of most social situations, which seemed to shift depending on variables I couldn't always identify or predict. I was good at it, really good, and that created its own complications. Primary school was mostly fine. I got along with teachers. I was naturally bright. But the other girls, and this was something I picked up on early, even if I didn't have language for it, didn't quite know what to do with me. I wasn't girly in the way they were girly. I didn't care about the things they cared about. I was too physical, too direct, too interested in how far I could push myself in training rather than in conversations about boys and social media and whatever else was circulating that week. They weren't cruel about it exactly, I just existed slightly outside the category they understood. I noticed, I didn't say much about it, I filed it away and kept training. At home, Mum had her things and I had mine, and the overlap was her things. When we did something together, it was something she wanted to do: reading, sailing, sitting quietly. And I don't want to be unfair to her here, because those weren't bad experiences. Sailing was actually something I liked, but I recognized even then that the condition of her engagement was that I came into her world, she didn't really come into mine. Dad came into mine. He played Minecraft with me even though he was hopeless at it. He came to every training session he could manage. He wasn't naturally sporty, but he learned enough to ask intelligent questions about my technique, my times, my goals. He took me to training at 6 in the morning without complaint. He sat in the cold bleachers in the rain with a thermos of coffee, watching me compete. He was my person. Simple as that. Adolescence complicated things, the way it tends to. The social landscape at school shifted in the ways those landscapes shift. Alliances formed, hierarchies solidified, and the space I'd managed to occupy became narrower. I tried aligning with the sporty girls. That didn't really work. I was too competitive, too serious about training in a way that read as intense rather than fun. I tried crossing into the mixed group, the boys and girls who played sport together. That earned me the label of trying too hard, from girls who'd wanted those boys' attention and didn't appreciate the competition. I also got into gaming. World of Warcraft mostly, and then a stretch of fantasy MMOs that took up a significant portion of my evenings and weekends. It was the same thing as sport in a different frame. Rules, structure, a world with clear internal logic, a community where competence was valued and social performance was optional. Mom hated it. She didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it, and made her feelings fairly clear. You're wasting your time. You should be reading. Why can't you be interested in something worthwhile? Dad played Minecraft with me. That's the difference in 2 sentences. By the time I was in my later years of high school, I'd found my group, and I want to be honest about who they were because I think it matters. They were the kids who didn't fit anywhere else, the quiet ones, the odd ones, the ones who'd been on the periphery of every social group long enough to end up at the same table by default. My behavior wasn't always great during that period. I got in trouble more than I used to. I wasn't listening as well. But I had somewhere to go at lunchtime, and at that age that matters more than I think adults ever fully remember. Mom's response to this period was, "Do better." That phrase became a refrain in our house. It was her answer to most things. Struggling with a subject? Do better. Friendship drama? Do better. Didn't finish the assigned reading? Do better. It was a phrase that assumed the problem was effort rather than circumstance, which said a lot about how she understood the world and not much about how she understood me.
In my final year of school, I hurt my arm at the gym, badly enough to need surgery. I don't think I can explain adequately what it means to take exercise away from someone for whom exercise is a primary regulation tool. If you've never relied on movement to manage your own nervous system, it might sound like an inconvenience. It was not an inconvenience. It was like having the pressure valve removed from a system that builds pressure constantly. For the first time in my life, I was still. And still meant stuck at home with increasingly difficult schoolwork I was falling behind on because of missed time, with a body I didn't recognize as mine, and with Mom, whose patience for a homebound, dysregulated, struggling teenager was, it turned out, quite limited. I got my results at the end of the year. I'd wanted to study sports science, had worked toward it for years, but university felt suddenly impossibly far away. Not because of the grades, because of everything else. That was when the anxiety really arrived. Not the social anxiety I'd always had humming in the background, something heavier, something that made leaving the house feel genuinely impossible on some days, something that sat on my chest in the morning and made the simplest things, getting dressed, making a decision, answering a text, feel like they required more energy than I had. It was around this time that I was assessed and given an autism diagnosis. Dad found it useful. It gave language to things he'd observed for years, the way I needed structure, the intensity of my interests, the difficulty I had with social ambiguity, the way exercise wasn't just a hobby but a neurological necessity. He went away and read about it and came back with a different kind of patience, if that makes sense, a more informed one. Mom thought it was made up. You just need to try harder. You just need to push through. Other people manage. Why can't you manage? Do better. The next 5 years are hard to summarize without making them sound more dramatic than they were, and also without underselling how genuinely difficult they were. Both things are true simultaneously. I was at home, mostly in my room. The anxiety had become severe enough that I'd stopped leaving the house with any regularity, which, if you've never experienced that particular kind of trapped, is both as awful as it sounds and also, perversely, a relief. The world outside had become unpredictable in ways I couldn't manage. Inside, I could control the variables. The first couple of years, the gym was still available to me. I trained constantly, maybe more than I should have, because it was the one thing that still worked, the one place where I felt functional and capable and in control of something. I got very fit, and then I got sick. A virus, the kind that usually lasts a week, didn't leave. Weeks stretched into months.
I'd feel slightly better, try to resume training, relapse. Try again, relapse again. My body, which had always been the most reliable thing about me, stopped being reliable. And then the months became a year, and I'd stopped training altogether, and I didn't like what I saw in the mirror, and I felt too embarrassed to go back to the gym looking the way I looked after stopping, which is the kind of logic that makes perfect sense from inside it and sounds absurd from outside it. But that's where I was. Online gaming became more central. I stayed up late, partly because I genuinely enjoyed it, partly because late nights meant fewer hours when Mum was awake and I might have to interact with her. We had developed, over these years, a relationship that was mostly composed of friction. She snapped more, she made comments about the cost of having me at home, not frequently, but enough that each one lodged. She seemed embarrassed by me in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel, like my presence in her life had become a liability. Dad carried a lot during this period. He got support services involved, multiple at different points, psychologists, specialists, people who understood the specific intersection of anxiety and neurodivergence that I was living in. He handled the logistics of appointments, the paperwork, the advocacy. He was endlessly patient in a way that cost him things I didn't fully appreciate until later. Then came the hospital. I won't go into detail because it was what it was and it served its purpose. A few weeks as an inpatient, a proper assessment of what was and wasn't working medication-wise, and at the end of it a new diagnosis, ADHD along with the autism. This was actually significant because the medications I'd been given over the years, which hadn't worked, which sometimes made things worse, had been the wrong medications for the wrong understanding of what was happening in my brain. This felt like the first genuinely useful piece of information in years. I came home from the hospital to my dad standing at the door, looking so visibly relieved to see me that I started crying before I was even out of the car. He hugged me for a long time. He was excited about the ADHD diagnosis, the way you're excited when something finally has a name. Not because having a name makes it better, but because a name means there's a map, and a map means there might be a way through. Mum was inside. She didn't hug me. She asked how I was feeling in a tone that suggested the answer was a formality. And then, over the following days, something shifted in her that I hadn't anticipated. Or maybe it had been building and the hospital admission had tipped it past a threshold. She was sharper, more impatient. She made a comment about the cost of the hospital, not the emotional cost, the financial one, in a way that made me feel like an invoice she hadn't budgeted for. She said something to a friend on the phone that I overheard, something about how embarrassing it was, having a daughter who'd been in a mental health ward. What would people think? I didn't say anything. Do better. A few weeks after I came home, on an ordinary afternoon that had given no particular indication of what was about to happen, Dad was in the kitchen putting together dinner. He asked me to go out to the garden and pick some basil and some capsicum. I went out. The garden is small and familiar. I've been looking at it my whole life. I found the basil, started cutting. Mum was out there too, in the late afternoon sun, sitting with a cup of tea and her book. I registered her presence. I tried to stay in the task. She looked up. "Why are you cutting that one? That one's been growing well. The one next to it is much better. Do you actually pay attention to anything?" And I said I was sorry. I reached for the other plant. "In one day," she said, mostly to herself, but not quite. "In one day, you can't do one thing right." I kept my eyes on the basil, kept cutting. And then, and I don't know how to explain exactly what happened in my nervous system in that moment, except to say that something that had been compressed for a very long time found a crack and moved through it. I heard myself saying, loudly, with more force than I had used in years, "You are a nightmare of a person." And then I had the garden shears in my hand and I pointed them at my own chest and I said, "Is this what you want? You clearly don't want me here. Is this what you want?" I want to be completely clear about what was happening in that moment because I know how it reads. I was not threatening my mother. She was 5 meters away from me. I wasn't moving toward her. I was in a state of total overwhelm, the kind that doesn't leave a clean record of its own logic. And what came out of me was an expression of despair, not a threat of violence. The shears pointed at me, at myself. The question was directed at her, but the gesture was about my own pain. I did not intend to harm her. I did not intend to harm myself. I was a person who had spent years being slowly diminished, who'd just come home from a psychiatric ward, who'd been told once too many times that they couldn't do anything right, and finally made a sound. That is what happened. Mum put her cup down. Her hand was shaking. She said, "You are crazy. You need to go back to the mental health ward. This is too much. I can't deal with this." And she walked to her car and she drove away. Dad came out. Mum was gone. I fell to my knees in the garden. I don't fully remember deciding to do this, it just happened. And he came and put his arms around me and held me up, and I tried to explain through the crying what had just happened. He called Mum. She didn't answer. An hour and a half later, she came home. She didn't say anything about what happened. She said dinner needed finishing. We ate. We were nearly done when there was a knock at the front door. 2 police officers. I remember the specific quality of the silence that fell when Dad opened the door. I remember the way Mum looked from across the room, not shocked, not distressed. There was something else in her expression, something almost settled. I understand now what that expression was. She had done what she'd gone to do. She had made a decision in the hour and a half she was gone, and she had followed through with it, and she had come home and sat through dinner waiting for the outcome. The police said they needed to speak with me. I didn't understand what was happening fast enough to respond coherently. I backed toward my room. Dad stepped in front of the officers, not aggressively, just with the presence of a man who needed a moment, and went to me and said quietly, "Let's just talk to them." We came out. The officers explained that my mother had been to the police station. She had filed for an apprehended violence order. She had given a statement. There was a possible charge of threatening with a weapon. I looked at my dad. He was crying, quietly, standing very still, crying. One of the officers, a woman, young, with an expression that had something almost apologetic in it, said, "This happens. Get some legal advice. It'll likely be okay." It was not okay. 2 weeks later, I was in court. The violence order was granted. The charge of threatening behavior was recorded. Every word I had said in that garden, every word that had been wrung out of me after years of compression, had been transcribed into a formal statement and used methodically against me. I went from struggling daughter to criminal in one afternoon. My dad stood up in that courtroom and said with more steadiness than I think I could have managed, "You cannot do this to our daughter." Nobody listened in the way it mattered. That night, he took me to a hotel. We sat in a room that was quiet and neutral and belonged to neither of us, and we didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. He'd spent 20-something years being the soft landing, the mediator, the person who smoothed the ground between my mom and me, so I didn't have to feel the full force of it. Standing in that hotel room, I think he finally understood that he hadn't been protecting me. He'd been buffering a situation that had always been going to reach this point, or somewhere like it. The buffer just delayed the arrival. We were very tired, both of us. The particular tiredness of people who have been inside something for so long that the shape of it has become invisible, and who are only now, at this awful late stage, seeing it clearly. I'm writing this because I need someone outside of it to tell me if I'm seeing it right. I know how it looks. I know that a woman in a garden with shears pointing at herself and shouting is not a calm picture. I know that what came out of me that afternoon was not measured or controlled or easy to contextualize without the full history behind it. But I also know this. I yelled once. Once in 20-something years of absorbing, complying, doing better, trying harder, being still when I needed to move, being quiet when I needed to scream. Once on the worst afternoon of a very long bad stretch, 2 weeks after leaving a psychiatric ward, with garden shears in my hand that were never once directed at another person. And she drove to a police station and had me charged. Not because she feared for my safety. I believe in the clear-eyed part of myself that the hospital stay helped me reclaim, that she was not afraid of me that afternoon. I believe she was angry and humiliated, and that a formal authority, police, courts, a violence order, felt like the one mechanism available to her that would put me back in a position where I couldn't challenge her. You are crazy. Go back to the mental health ward. Label it, contain it, restore the order. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand how a mother gets to that place, but I know that I'm done trying to earn my way out of her disappointment. I'm done being the person who absorbs things quietly and then gets charged when the absorption fails. Dad and I are looking at living arrangements. Mom is still in the house. There is a violence order that restricts my contact with her, which is the most surreal sentence I have ever typed about my own family. I yelled once in 20 years. She called the police. Was I wrong?
Right. So, I don't even know where to start with this one because there are so many layers here that I keep pulling one back and finding another one underneath it. Let me start with the obvious question because I know some of you are sitting there thinking it. Was what Alice did in that garden threatening behavior? And I want to actually engage with that because I think it deserves a real answer rather than a reflexive one. She was distressed. She had shears in her hand. She raised her voice, and she pointed the shears at herself, not at her mother, not toward her mother, at her own chest, while asking a question that was fundamentally about her own pain. Now here's the thing. If you read that scene and you don't know anything about Alice, about the autism, about the ADHD, about the 5 years of isolation and the hospital admission 2 weeks earlier, and the 20 years of being told to do better, then maybe it reads as threatening. Maybe a stranger watching through a fence would have been alarmed. But her mother was not a stranger. Her mother knew everything. And I keep asking myself, does a person who genuinely feared for their safety go home, sit through dinner, and wait for the knock at the door? Or does that look more like someone who made a decision and followed through on it? Because those are two very different things. Here's what I think is actually happening in this family, and tell me if this sounds familiar. Alice's mom has never had a language for what Alice is. Not the autism, not the ADHD, not the way Alice experiences sensory overwhelm or emotional intensity, or the absolute necessity of physical movement just to stay regulated. She doesn't have the framework, and she hasn't tried to build one. And when you don't have a framework for someone, the easiest available explanation for behavior you don't understand is they're difficult, they're dramatic, they need to do better. And that explanation works right up until the moment the person you've been calling difficult is standing in your garden having the worst afternoon of their life, and the explanation stops fitting. What does she do in that moment? Does she ask what's wrong? Does she go inside and give Alice space? Does she, I don't know, consider the fact that her daughter came home from a mental health ward 2 weeks ago and might be fragile? No. She files a police report. And this is the part that I genuinely struggle with, because going to the police, not in fear, but in the hour and a half she was sitting in a car somewhere deciding what to do, that's a choice. That's not a trauma response. That is a considered decision to use a formal authority to manage a situation she has never wanted to understand. The really painful thing? Dad has been mediating between these two his entire marriage, softening things, absorbing things, making sure Alice had a landing pad when Mom was too much. And what this story shows is that sometimes, when you keep smoothing over something for long enough, you stop both people from ever actually having to face it. He protected Alice, but the thing under the surface never got addressed, and eventually the surface gives way.
I'm not saying that to blame him. I think he was doing the best he knew with what he had, but it's worth sitting with, because the moment he stopped mediating, the moment he stood in that courtroom and said, "You can't do this to our daughter," was also the moment everything finally became visible. Too late to undo it, but visible. So, was Alice wrong? I'll say this much. What came out of Alice in that garden was 20 years of compression finally breaking through the wall. It wasn't a threat. It was a person finally making a sound. And her mother's response? Not comfort, not concern, not even anger in the moment, was to find a mechanism to put her back in a box. A violence order, a criminal charge, a label that now follows Alice everywhere she goes. You are crazy. She didn't call for help, she called for control. Drop your thoughts below. I'll see you in episode 3.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.